Hey everyone, Ashley Kahn here for the BIAM PDX Jazz Festival. Once again, it is my honor, it is my privilege to be asked to host these great interviews, discussions that are bringing the stories and the history of the music out front and connecting with the performances that are part of this pandemic version of the PDX Jazz Festival. Remote and online live streaming events. And right now, we're going to be talking with a very special person, a very special, creative force. And to call him a keyboardist or a composer, band leader, conductor, uh, uh, educator, scene starter is all too limiting. He's all of those and much more. In fact, he is defined by the fact that he does not fit into an easily defined role within the music scene. And I'm talking about Wayne Horvitz, who's going to be talking to us from Seattle. The two of us have known each other for many years. We go back to New York City back in the wild and woolly 1980s, you know. I don't know even, and I'm talking about 1980s, not 1880s, right, Wayne?
Hmm.
So, the idea of one artist taking on any which role to keep the scene moving, to keep the music moving, et cetera, is something that you have taken to so naturally and so consistently throughout your career. I salute everything that you've done, Wayne, and continue to do. And it's great to see you again.
It's great to see you again. Thanks for having me. Really a pleasure.
Well, you have somewhat of a kind of honored spot of bringing the festival to a close. You're doing the closing set for this year's PDX Jazz Festival. That's going to be on February 27th at 8 p.m. Originally, it was going to be in Portland. You were going to bring your group, the Royal We, down to Portland, but because of lockdown situation, we're actually going to hear you from your home location. And why don't you tell us about that and what we can expect?
Well, the band's called the Royal We because it started out in the lounge of a club called the Royal Room. And the Royal Room is called the Royal Room because I started this club with two other people, Steve Freeborn and Tia Matthews, who were the proprietors of the OK Hotel in the 90s in Seattle. Now, you being an East Coaster, you might not know much about the OK Hotel, but fairly legendary club and one of my all-time favorite clubs. Nirvana first played Smells Like Teen Spirit there, all the early Soundgarden, all sorts of people. But Robin Holcomb, my wife, and Hel Frizzell, the guitarist, and Michael Shreve, and it was a great place. Anyway, the earthquake knocked that down in 2001 or whenever it was, and I approached them about starting some place in the south end of Seattle, my neighborhood, Columbia City, and it's called the Royal Room. We rent from an African-American social club, the only historically African-American social club still in existence, called the Royal Esquire Club. And this room was called the Royal Room. It's the smaller of the two spaces, though it's nicely sized. So it's a club, and I've been involved in that. The Royal mostly we use the main stage, but sometimes on a Tuesday or Wednesday, we'd have these kind of gigs in the lounge. You'd have to see it, but it's in the front of the club as you walk in. And it was an extremely casual project. It's kind of a way for me to get out of the house once in a while when I was home. So with Skerrick, who will be playing with us, the original members are not the same as in the band now. And that's the genesis of that band. Frankly, of all my projects, the Royal We have not really played. We haven't really played a big stage much, so I'm excited for this PDX Jazz thing.
And the Royal We is it's an ongoing quintet, or is it kind of rotating membership type of deal?
Good question, because I guess the answer is both. So it was a quartet originally. This version's a sextet. Originally, actually, come to think of it, it was bass and percussion and Skerrick on saxophone, and then I added I replaced the percussion with the drums. I added the percussion back in. Now I have a violin, and I've changed the bass player and the drummer. But all that being said, probably of almost any band I have, the compositions are really kind of minimal. They're more partly because of the original percussion I used from Senegal. I did a lot of 6/8 pieces and just stuff to just get to play, almost antithetical to what I've mostly been doing, which has been, fairly long form compositional things, electronic things. This was just a playing gig, which is why I did it in the front of the club casually on Tuesday nights. But then I started to really enjoy it, so I figured I'd give it a larger life.
Well, I'd like to come back to and discuss Royal We a little bit more because, that's what you're going to be focused on the 27th. But Royal We is just one of a few ensembles that you're involved with and leading. And I was wondering if you could tell us about the other ensembles and the creative approach to each. Is it different with each? I'm
Oh
talking
God, yeah,
about, okay.
yeah, totally. Sorry to interrupt, but
No,
yeah,
no, no.
totally. I would say the Royal We, as I just said, and actually, honestly, I mean, I don't want to. I love it. I love everybody in there, but it just seemed to fit the PDX Jazz Festival for a variety of reasons. But it really has been something I've been doing, like I said, as a vehicle to play and to get together with people. Currently, I just put out a record with Sarah Schoenbeck, who was a member of the Gravitas Quartet, which was a quartet with Ron Miles and a cellist from Vancouver named Peggy Lee. And Sarah's a bassoon player, so that's we, like everyone, had a tour lined up to support the record, which was canceled because of the pandemic. I've been working with a brand new trio with a cellist here in town, Hyun Kim, and a woman who sings named Aisha Brooks, who I've been working with in other projects. That's been local. I've been writing a lot. During COVID, I've been sending tracks to people like Nels Cline and Jeff Parker and Bobby Previtt and Ron Miles and making little trio overdub things. And then finally, actually, one of the biggest things I did in COVID was I just wrote a piece. I wrote a piece in 2012, not a piece, excuse me, a book of kind of piano pieces in the spirit of the Bartok books for young pianists, Microcosmos they're called. And I wrote a piece called Little Pieces for the Piano. And I wrote a bunch of new pieces for that in March as soon as lockdown happened. And I finally got that published, a couple of weeks ago. It's finally available. So that was a lot of work. I thought it would take me a month and it took me 6. You know how that goes.
I was going to say, all the projects you're working on did not even touch upon what I was expecting you to mention, which is, of course, the Royal Room Collective and or Royal Room Collective Music Ensemble, to give the full title, as well as Electric Circus.
Yeah, well, sorry, you're right. I mean,
no,
both
it's
of those
okay.
Are kind of, no, I'm joking, but those are a little older. The Royal Room Collective Music Ensemble. I mean, that was just one of those things where, I mean, let me just put this as bluntly as possible. Having a club is mostly a pain in the ass. Excuse me, but that's the fact. One of the great things, though, is that you can do things that you might not get to do otherwise on a kind of regular basis. Now, of course, you're not going to do that on a Saturday night just because of the economics, but I started shortly after the club opened in 2011, doing a regular Monday night gig with a kind of modified big band where I didn't play, but I conducted. And the idea was to take the Butch Morris conduction language and apply it mostly to my own compositions. So we do some other, there's a couple of Monk tunes in there. There's a arrangement of a Gershwin ballad, but mostly it's my music. Every Monday night, of course, it hasn't happened for over a year. And frankly, even in the last year or so, it hasn't been as often. But for a while, we were every Monday night. So after about 3 or 4 years, I decided to go into the studio. And I think you've heard a couple of tracks off that CD. And man, it's the easiest record I ever made in my life. I mean, we had been playing every Monday night for 5 years. We just went in. I had 2 strategies. In the day, we recorded. And in the evening, we had a drink and recorded. I mean, that was basically the 2 different approaches. And so, we had been playing in a bar for 5 years. So I felt like we should replicate that in the studio just to a small extent. But, we recorded 2 nights and I didn't even mix all the material I ended up going away with. And it was just so much fun. so often you go into the studio, you have some new music, you rehearse it. The first thing you do is go into the studio with it. 3 years later, you go, gee, I wish I could record that again. This was not the case with this. Electric Circus is a very casual project, and it really is, again, with the Butch Morris conduction language, I take very small motifs, like from a James Brown tune or a Los Lobos tune or Electric Miles, a bit of Sun Ra, some Grateful Dead. I mean, literally just stuff. I mean, some people here probably don't know that Electric Circus was a club in the West Village in the 60s. So it was one of the very first gigs I went to. My brother Lee.
And when you say West Village, you're talking about New York City.
Sorry, East Village. I'm wrong. It's on St. Mark's.
Oh, it's East Village. That's right.
Yeah, Electric Circus was a kind of near where St. Mark's Books used to be, etc. My brother Lee took me when I was in 7th grade to hear Willie Dixon at the Electric Circus with a full light show. I was 13 years old. So it was kind of an important moment for me. But the idea of a light show and this so I took mostly riffs from the 60s and 70s. And it's just a chance to get a bunch of great improvisers together. But, and I hate to say this because it sounds a little bit, I don't know what it sounds like, but let's just face it, people recognize the Sly Stone riff and they're engaged. And then I can take the music wherever I want it, as long as I bring it back to something like that. So it's one of the few improvised music conduction gigs I do where people are also dancing. But it doesn't keep us from taking the music, as far away from that as I want to. So it's been a ton of fun. It's great. I don't know what I'm going to do with it, but it's been a ton of fun.
Well, I think if there was one word that connects all of what you're doing, fun is one of those things. I mean, obviously there's there's a different emotional flavor and the textures and the tones are so different, but at the same time, you are so absorbing. And watching videos online. I mean, just on videos themselves, but live, you were always such a absorbing performer, and there was always this feeling of like being involved and inside the music and the creative process. So, I think that all of these groups kind of share that idea that, you make that creative spark available to the listener and to the audience.
Well, I think that's nice to hear. I think when you think about, improvised music, obviously it's collaborative, and but there's so many different versions of that. I mean, collaborative can mean, deciding that the saxophone solo is going to take 8 choruses on a tune, and then the trumpet player is going to take 8 choruses, and a huge amount of great music has been made that way. But that's not the kind of collaborative part I've been interested in. I started really late. I didn't start playing till I was in my teens, and really not till I got to college. So I always joke that I always was, and even wanted to be, the worst player in any band. I learned so much from people around me. I remember starting the New York Composers Orchestra, and I was just trying to write big band music. All these guys, women and men, had played in big bands in high school and all this stuff. And they're like, Wayne, you can't do it this way. This needs to be like this and this. And so I kind of feel like I've just been a really late starting student my whole life. And it keeps making me want to check new things out and figure them out.
Well, the argument is that then you bring a certain maturity to it that you wouldn't have, in earlier years, and a deeper appreciation, and that's always been, something that I've gotten from you. I don't know if you recall, but there was one time at the Second Avenue Club, probably Nightingales or something like that, where there was a Prince tune on the jukebox that you turned me on to. I think it was like the B-side, a really rare B-side Prince tune, and having you walk me through the tune. I think it was "How Come You Don't Call Me Anymore."
It is definitely that tune. Yeah.
And it still sticks to me to this day, of like being turned on, and then not realizing that, you were aware of Prince in addition to, avant-garde jazz and of course classical music too.
Well, when Prince died, just to show you, to continue that sensibility, when Prince died, my daughter sent me, who she was already in her 20s, my daughter sent me a video that she had found online of Prince sound checking that very song because she had heard me in the house, play it all the time. Yeah, I think it's the B-side of Let's Go Crazy. And it's unbelievable piano playing. But above all, I think it goes back to, whether it's the art ensemble or the band or Prince or Hendrix or Ligeti, it always goes back to this thing of trying to figure out how you can make something that has the feeling you get from that music, which is very different than going out and trying to imitate it per se. Yeah, I remember that song being on that jukebox because it hadn't been released except as a single. It's the only place you could hear it at that time. But I forgot that I'd showed it to you.
Well, I've never forgotten that. Thank you again. Why don't we, we're talking about the music and we're talking about these different groups. Why don't we play one of the videos now that we've put together? We've got the Royal Room Collective Music Ensemble doing Sweeter Than the Day. So, that was Sweeter Than the Day, Royal Room Collective Music Ensemble. Anything you'd like to share about that, Wayne?
No, it's just a tune of mine. I actually performed it with someone last night for a town hall here in Seattle for another pandemic live stream. It's a tune of mine for a band that later I had a band called Sweeter Than the Day, and this band, the Westerlies, who's a brass quartet, have been playing it a lot. And it's sort of just been a mainstay. And that's a tune where I tend to go light on the conduction because there's kind of chord changes involved, and as opposed to really breaking up the tune the way I do in some other types of pieces like that.
Tell us about conduction and that tradition. There's not many purveyors of that approach to improvised conducting, which is, I guess, what conduction is.
Right.
is the definition of.
Right, and there's some other systems too. I forget. I feel terrible. There's some people in town do this sound painting, which I'll think of his name in a minute. But interesting guy in New York, also in the late 70s and 80s, was doing. In fact, I had friends, Jason Wang, my brother Bill, other people who had played, Walter Thompson. In any event,
Right.
With the Butch Morris system, it was Butch who called it conduction, which is obviously a play on the word, conducting and conductor. And Butch was actually, lots of jazz historians are going to correct me, but this is the basic gist of it. I know Butch was doing it in the David Murray Band. And in the David Murray Band, David was using themes and written material, and Butch was then extending the material with hand signals. Try to get in the camera here. Things like long tones and loops and things that he would do. He would take the motifs. So then Butch got into a process where he wasn't really interested in doing it with any written material anymore, and he wanted the foundation of the music to be essentially improvised, but with a lot of structural integrity and structural. I'm going to be redundant here. A lot of structure coming from his control of the music. I think a lot of it had to do with being some frustration with kind of the tendency of free improvisation to kind of always go in certain directions. And I think another part of it came from the frustration of not being able to do free improvisation in larger ensembles as easier as in smaller ensembles. In any event, I think of myself really honestly as kind of conduction light. I mean, Butch, really, this became this whole work towards the end of his life. And I like to use it as just one thing in my, toolbox as a composer. And, but I have found it in these large ensembles to be really useful and really fun. And above all, I think it keeps the musicians really excited. You're not just playing these charts and taking solos. They have to stay engaged because they have to stay looking at the conductor the whole time. So I use it with written material. And as I said before, I use it like on my tunes. What I'll do is I'll have a chart of my tune, play the theme, you play the bridge, play the theme again. There might be a solo form. But at the end of the chart, there'll be little motifs like 1 measure, 2 measures, 4 measures that have numbers on them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, etc. And I hold up a finger and I go, so I can have the alto player playing number 1 while the other alto player is playing number 2, while the bass player is playing number 4. And in some ways, actually, particularly in the swing-based music that the Royal Rome Collective Music Ensemble does part of the time, it's kind of like the next step after Mingus. Mingus had all these riff-based things. And that takes me to Electric Circus, which is different because I'm not using my music. I'm using classic music from the 60s and 70s. But again, it's all about putting riffs against riffs. So there's a little Charles Ives in there, too. You can have a Sly Stone tune going in E flat minor while there's a Los Lobos riff in A, and they can happen at the same time, and you get a sometimes really awesome, sometimes you just want to get the hell out of there and move on because it's not working, But that keeps it interesting, and definitely, analogous to things like John Zorn's game pieces and other things like that. Whether the music is great or not, there's no question the music couldn't have been made any other way. Certain things happen with conduction or game pieces that just aren't going to happen otherwise. And so that's exciting.
That's great. Let's hear, let's actually watch an Electric Factory moment right now in which we can see you doing conduction as the group is performing. And this is an art ensemble of Chicago piece, correct?
Yeah, and usually I have like multiple pieces going on at once, but then once a night, because I love this song so much, I'll just call this tune, but I still use some conduction. Yeah.
That's great. I mean, I got to say that, back in the 80s in New York, the idea of not just conduction, but of a conductor being up there and working with the group, whether it was like Greg Tate or Kip Hanrahan or Stephen Bernstein, it seemed normal. It wasn't an unusual thing to see back then, and to see you carrying it forward. I don't care if it's light or not. The fact that it continues to be part of the musical palette that you can draw from, speaks to its enduring value.
No, I agree, and I take that back about light. I meant that it's not like sort of my life's work, But like I said, it's like Butch gave me this gift of like one way to approach this music. I'm going to use pencil and paper on this. I'm going to use a computer on this. I'm going to use conduction on this. I'm going to use a quartet for this. It's all just to me. It's the music's all the same. It's just a different orchestration and a different technical approach.
Let's continue with the idea of New York, because I don't want our viewers to think that you grab these ideas and then you replanted them in Seattle, but the idea that you planted seeds here in New York that continued to grow even after you left. One of the most, your relationship with Knitting Factory, helping Michael Dorf and that whole team kind of focus on the music that they became known for. And then the sound of like groups like The Presidents were so in the air, in the early 80s, and kind of united the punk scene and the avant-garde jazz scene. And, you brought stuff together in a way that continues to happen here.
Yeah, well, the Knitting Factory was, one of those classic things completely by accident. And there were 3 people in the audience, and I didn't know it was a gig. I thought it was like a restaurant gig. In those days, we used, we had 2 types of gigs. We had real gigs, and we had gigs we did to make money where you were playing. I literally thought, in fact, I was subbing for someone when I played the first time at the Knitting Factory. He had booked 2 gigs for himself and asked me to play one of them. But Joe Gallant was in that band, I believe. Dave Toronto, it might have been Hobby Previtt, but I don't even think we were playing my music. Anyway, that's a long story, not that important, but I just kind of said to those guys, you're not really set up to have a jazz club, because you don't have a liquor license, which is true. You don't have a piano, but you are sort of set up to do something else. And so I booked a little series of duos. So the first one was with Fred Frith and Butch Morris, and a bunch of people came, and we went from there. 6 months later, I couldn't get a gig there. The President is really on my mind right now, because a friend of mine who helped me years later, a younger guy, works for the Smithsonian now, actually, and is in the music side of the Smithsonian, convinced me to start releasing some tapes, live tapes, on a kind of, not just stick them up on Bandcamp, but treat them a little more seriously. So the first one I'm doing is The President live at CBGB's. Ashley, The President is very, it's very controversial here, because, of course, it was a famous band called the Presidents of the United States of America. That was a Seattle-based band, and my band was originally called the President of the United States of America, and but it was later just known as the President. So I actually know these guys. It's been the source of a certain amount of humor between us, but I was first, just for the record. In any event, this gig at CBGB's, I've been writing about it. I found some tapes from 1982 at CBGB's. I found some demos in 84, and I found this gig in 87. And it's just interesting to think back on, how I came to making that music, what worked and what didn't, because I think there are some things that hold up and some things that don't. And interestingly enough, I think sometimes the things I did with like drum machines and synthesizer at home and had guests come in and play on them hold up better than the band as a band in the normal sense. And then some parts of the band in the normal sense just sound fantastic to me, So it's been an interesting time. In the meantime, the first record that I ever made that included drum machines and synthesizers is being re-released on a German label. No, excuse me, a Spanish label right now on vinyl. So it's interesting that you should talk to me about the stuff now, because suddenly I haven't thought about this stuff for years, and suddenly it's, I've been writing about it and dealing with it. But yeah, amazing stuff. And all the stuff that was so random. Bobby Previtt claims that I hadn't even heard him play the drums when I asked him to come and try something out with me. I just knew him through Elliott Sharp. And I don't know if that's true or not, but in any event, man, if I hadn't used Bobby in that music never would have been what it was, So it was great. It was a great neighborhood to live in. You could run into, all the people you were working with and half of the people who inspired you within, 30 blocks of each other. It's pretty incredible.
So true. So true. Everything, and it's, that all that area is still there, but it's been so gentrified, and, there's no more CBGBs, there's so few clubs, but all those Second Avenue, I actually remember meeting you and Bobby playing with Bobby Radcliffe in a blues band, that's how I got to know you guys,
Yeah.
and then,
no, I remember that.
The thing about the President was that the sound of that group, for my generation, for our generation, became such a part of the New York sound, along with, Lounge Lizards, along with Old and New Dreams. I mean, there was David Murray, and like you said, Butch Morris, that was the sound of those years in Manhattan. And it doesn't go away. So I'm not surprised to hear that, there's this hunger to get that music out again, because it lasts. And one of the other things, Wayne, and, I've got to say that, when digital synthesizers came in, there was this unbelievable impact on music in general. Everything started to sound the same because everybody was using the damn presets on their Yamaha DX7s. You weren't. You were being very creative with the sounds you were making happen with the President, especially.
Well, thank you. Yeah, that was such an important keyboard at the time, and quickly became a keyboard that everyone loved to hate. And for me, it was partly a lot of work I put into getting sounds out of it that I liked, and partly it was the fact that I quickly became too lazy to learn really any other keyboards that well, with the exception of one or two. But I still use it today, and I still use some of the same effects on it, et cetera, et cetera. But it allowed me to do things at the time. And I think that one thing, and this is kind of nerding out a little bit, but the DX7 was particularly lousy at things like sustain sounds and brass sounds and stuff like that. They were hipper analog keyboards, but it was pretty good at things that have the same kind of attack as a piano, like a vibraphone sound and a marimba sound and a Wurlitzer electric piano sound, particularly for its day. And those are the things that I wanted to use because I was a pianist. So it got me both still approaching rhythmic things and the kind of structured tunes the way I would harmonically at the piano, but inspired me kind of sonically because I had some other resources. So it's, I kept using it.
I think we should hear one of those tunes right now. I know you picked out a track from the 1985 album Dinner at 8, one of the President's, if not the best known President album. And the track is This New Generation. Nice to revisit that. That's Doug Wieselman on sax and Elliot Sharp on guitar, and the
Yeah.
rest is you.
Yeah, I mean, that's, and actually just a small correction, that wasn't the first president record. That was kind of pre the president. I mean, that was all a thing I put together with just a couple of keyboards. I mean, for the recording nerds out there, I had one 8-track reel-to-reel. I had a 10-channel board. I had one DX7. I had one drum machine and a spring reverb. And so Elliot happened to be in San Francisco. I actually made that in San Francisco. My wife, Robin, and I had been out there for a year, sort of during the time we lived in New York. And Elliot came by one day and put some tracks down. Doug was in and out of San Francisco for various reasons, put some tracks down. So so when the band started playing that tune, we had to kind of work out how to approach it. Of course, it wasn't too hard. I had some pretty good musicians in the band, but it was, there were sort of things that were written for the band, and then there were things that were created like this that then had to be translated to the band. So the opening track on this CBGB's gig that's going to be released in just right around the time of this Portland jazz gig, actually, I think it's being released the Friday before, come to think of it, the day before, opens with the same tune, but with a very different, with a full-on band onslaught with Elliot Sharp and Dave Tronzo on guitar, Dave Hofstra on bass, Doug, and Bobby Previtt, who kind of eats it alive.
As is Bobby's want. He
Yes.
definitely is, someone who is such a magician on percussion. The other tracks, I can't recommend it enough for people who haven't experienced this music to go and check it out and really grab the flavor of what was the creative heart of the 1980s. And the various albums that have come out with Preston's music on it, including that one Elektra collection called This New Generation.
Right.
Tunes like True and Keep That Train Away From My Door. I mean, they're classics, in my mind. I was going to kind of shift the attention one more time to the classical side, because, one of the other people that you got very tight with when you were in New York, who went out to Seattle, was Bill Frisell. And, if you could talk to us about your relationship with him, and then we'll hear a more recent track, classical track that you've put together with him on it. A concerto.
There's sort of two sides to that. I mean, one is obviously Bill was just kind of amazing to get to know, and actually played on some of those early sort of pre-president records that got compiled into the album you referred to called This New Generation. So then Bill and I went on to do some duo things and he played in Naked City, as did I, which was John Zorn's band. So we had a lot of touring together. You're right, Bill did move to Seattle within a year of when Robin and I moved to Seattle. And so our kids kind of grew up together, and we kept doing all sorts of things together. And, not as much in recent years, but, and now Bill has moved back to New York, actually, which is great. He's got a great place out in Brooklyn. But a few years back, I approached Earshot Jazz, which is the sort of main jazz presenter here. It's not a club, it's a presenter. And they had been talking a little bit with the Seattle Symphony about trying to do some sort of collaborative thing. And, working with orchestral musicians, I think jazz musicians, I probably shouldn't say this, but I think they tend to make two mistakes. One is to try to have them act like jazz players rhythmically, and particularly to swing and things like that. Often doesn't work. To play with a rhythm section, which can work, but sort of upsets the balance of the orchestra. Or let me put it this way, it upsets the balance of what I think is the powerful thing about an orchestra potentially. And I'd already written some string quartets. I've written a lot of chamber music, and I felt like I'd written a chamber orchestra piece that Bill was the soloist on, called Joe Hill, in 2001. And it was about the story of the labor leader, Joe Hill. So fast forward 14, 15 years, and the Seattle Symphony agrees with Earshot Jazz to commission me to write a piece with Bill as the featured improviser. And this, to me, is the best of both worlds. You give the orchestra exactly what they're trained to do, which is to play written music really, 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 really well, and to learn it really quickly because they never have enough time to rehearse. It can virtually sight read anything. And then you give the improvising to the people who are brilliant improvisers, and that describes Bill Frisell, needless to say. So we did it, and then I, just was premiered one night, and then I raised some money. It took me a year or two to get it recorded, and then had Bill, in that case, Bill overdub. So that's that. And I've actually written 3 string quartets that have a featured improvised role. I've written quite a few other pieces with this kind of construct of through composed music for classically trained, or what I like to call just conservatory trained musicians, mixed with a star improviser. And some of them are modular. In other words, I have a string quartet where many, many different improvisers have been the featured improviser. It doesn't necessarily have to be a particular person or even a particular instrument. So in this case, however, it was really written with Bill in mind. And it's called Those Who Remain, and it was in 2 movements. And it's, under 20 minutes. It's a fairly short piece.
Why don't we hear a piece of that right now? Thanks for sharing that classical piece with us. Let's turn our attention to Royal We again, in this last concert. The one thing I wanted to ask and kind of get a grasp on is like how much of the music that you'll be performing on the 27th is going to be composed or prepared beforehand, and how much of it is like, spontaneous?
Well, all of the pieces are based on tunes. There's no like open improvised music, and so I'd say that in the sort of range of my music, it's sort of, I wouldn't call it on the conservative side, but it's fairly structured in that, you have themes and you have solos, but obviously people are improvising their solos and people are improvising their comping, but it looks and acts more like a jazz ensemble or an instrumental rock ensemble than some of my other music. But all the pieces are mine, and most of them are kind of, I'd say, they tend more towards the kind of groove side of my music, with a few exceptions. And I actually haven't 100% decided what we're playing, but it's mostly, and actually it's all pretty new, with one exception. It's all tunes that have never been played by any other band and haven't really been played that often and have never been recorded.
So it's going to be fresh.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for for taking on that bold role of closing out the festival this year. There's one more thing I wanted to ask, and this is more of a your own sort of personal philosophy and how it applies to current situation, the current situation we're in, because there's looking forward there, what the future will be for jazz clubs, for jazz performance, for jazz musicians and jazz careers. There's a lot of trepidation, and it seems to me that the model that you have always applied, this kind of do-it-yourself DIY spirit of creating the scene when there isn't a scene, or creating a club when there's no venue around for the music, that you create the conditions for the creativity as much as being creative, you know. And is this an effective? I mean, I see this as a possibly effective model to follow, in the post-pandemic reality that obviously is ahead of us.
Well, man, that's like another interview worth of stuff
I
to
know.
talk about. And also, when you say the current situation, and we're talking, immediately we're talking about the pandemic, but I'm also, right as we speak, the impeachment hearings are going on, and we've just had this unbelievable period of incredible institutional kerfuffle, and I don't the last 4 years for that matter. And then, as I like to say, if if you if you thought COVID was bad, wait till you get climate change. If people can't agree on wearing masks, where the hell does that leave us on how to allocate water? So I'm pretty, disturbed. I'm pretty grateful. And I definitely think that, we're improvisers. I mean, sitting around complaining about the music business is a real waste of time. It's just like, I mean, what's there to say? And I think one of the things that I've learned being on the presenter side as well as the artist side, and kind of on a lot of the different parts of this, being producer and stuff, is that, it's so short-sighted to blame the people right next to you, even though sometimes, stupid stuff happens. But as I like to say, to artists, particularly when I'm on the other side, I said, listen, it's not that no one's giving you any money. There is no money, or we have to figure out where to get the money. My father was in labor relations and is a huge supporter of unions, but he always made the point, and by the way, a great lover of music, but he always made the point that, unions for the arts were tricky because the whole relationship to work is different. And I mean, he's not the only person who's made that point, but he came at it from a pretty educated perspective. He helped negotiate the Metropolitan Opera labor contract, so he knew of what he spoke. But it's not only that the economic models are fraud, but they have to be constantly reinvented. I mean, COVID is just, we get through it, and hopefully we get back to at least some semblance of where we were. But at the same time, what I already knew, but I know even more having owned the club, is that, even when clubs are doing well, they're not doing well. I mean, it's no one's making money. Doing well means you're not going out of business, And so, yeah, I think you just got to keep, light on your feet. And I think I certainly feel like, it's hard to be bitter when you get to spend your whole life making music and hanging out with your friends, And so there's a lot to complain about, but it's just like not where I want to put my energies. I guess that's where I'll be.
Wayne, thank you so much for making the time for us today, and for years and years of inspiration.
Well, thank you.
Else, and we're looking forward to the date on the 27th, and
Great,
to be
man.
continued.
Great to see you again. Take it easy and take care.
As well, man. You do the same. Lots of love, man.